Amos Fortune, Free Man, Chapter 2, The Middle Passage. The captives were led through the jungle from early dawn until noon, when they reached the bank of a wide river. There, they were given water, but no food. Under the watchful eyes and ever-pointed muskets of their captors, they were allowed a brief rest while canoes were readied for the journey downstream. Coarse shouts and loud-voiced commands in a meaningless tongue filled the air. The Admunchi people, now so tired and hungry that their fright and bewilderment were secondary, squatted on the ground with heads between their knees. Atmun looked from one to another of them, signaling with his eyes, and through the weary group a quiver of hope ran, uniting them to him. Whatever they had left behind, whatever lay ahead, their chief was with them, their traditional father. They knew that he would care for them. Atmun realized that he and his people were being enslaved by power and cunning, and that they must abide their time until they could effect their release in some way. Slavery was a phase of tribal war, as old as African life itself, but the Admunchi had always been a free people, putting no bonds on others and resisting any put on them. Atmun looked from one face to another. He was troubled in his heart about his people, for something had made them abashed and spiritless. The slavers ate well and drank freely. Then, while the sun was at its highest, pouring fierce heat upon the land, they crept under crudely constructed shelters of wide palm leaves and slept. No one took any thought of the Admunchi. Under the rain of heat, they waited patiently, each one knowing that a rain of fire would be his if he moved. When the sun was westering and a breeze had come up to rustle the palms and ripple the river water, the white men came out from their shelters and started giving brisk commands, which the natives in their employ hastened to carry out. The captives were loaded into long canoes, 20 to a canoe, with a native in the stern to direct the course downstream. A white man in the bow faced the captives with musket loaded and leveled on them. Manacled and chained to each other, the Admunchi did little more than crouch in the boats, the women moaning to themselves. One of them, in the rear canoe, still held his head unbowed. He was determined to watch the course they were taking, so when the time came that they could assert their freedom, he would be able to lead his people back to their own village. The current was swift, and the long, narrow, heavily laden canoes moved down it easily. On both banks of the river rose a forest of huge trees, from whose tops trailed a network of vines and flowers. Below was the dense undergrowth of the jungle land. Now and again they passed small clearings where flocks of goats grazed, and tribesmen watched their goats with more interest than they did the canoes going down the river. At such places the eye could range inland from the sedgy shore to the river to distant walls of mountains. Atmun, with his keen sight, saw torrents of icy water rushing down rock slopes. Then the trees thickened again. The banks of the river were clothed with giant ferns and mosses. Leaves, large as cloaks, hung down from the trees. Monkeys, chattering in their aerial homes, peered out at the side of the canoes and swung from limb to limb to travel with them for a while. Sometimes, where the river lapped the shore, a hippopotamus lay sunning his great bulk, or a crocodile slept with his open mouth. The sun, though it had dropped far down the sky, still had the heat of day, and the forest blazed and quivered with its beams. Blossoms of brilliant hue were twice beautiful as they found their reflections in the water. All along the way, the land cried out the year's new growth. Reds, yellows, greens were still pale with spring, but under the sun's powerful rays they would soon intensify to the fullness of summer's coloring. More and more as the afternoon wore on, they passed places where the land had been subdued. Furrows had been made in it by tribesmen preparing it for tillage, and stone encampments instead of rude huts could be seen on the hilltops. Atmun saw it all. It was to him as if he had reached the world's horizon and stepped across it. So different was it to the world he had known. that one small village, hemmed around by the dense growth of the jungle. Hunger gnawed at Atmun, weariness weighed his limbs, and the seam made by the lash on his back ached at the blaze of the sun. But more than all that he had felt something expanding within him, a strange feeling that rose to meet the new world his eyes were absorbing. It was as far from elation as it was from fear, yet it was a compound of each. He, who had known nothing but the jungle, now found wonder stirring in him that there was a world beyond. Night came and the canoes glided down the river that was as dark as the sky above. They might have been moving through the sky, for the stars were found themselves in the water, and the points of light that quivered on the rippling waves. The captives, huddling against each other in what comfort they could in their chains, slept. The white man in the bow propped his musket between his knees and leaned his head forward. The steersman shifted less often, and Atmun turned his head up to the heavens, prayed to the spirit of the night, prayed to the spirit of the river, prayed to the spirit of his father. And the voice of the land gave answer. This was the time of birth, the time of renewing. The Admunshi were a peaceful people who killed the creatures of the jungle only in their need for food, and then burned the entrails in expiation to the spirit of the victim. Atmun knew his strength. He knew that he could break the bamboo withes that bound his wrists. He knew that he could kill with his hands. He clenched his hands together. He was the only man awake in the canoe, but his people would waken to a word, and they would do his bidding, since he was their chief. The only canoes were lost in the darkness before him. The other canoes were lost in the darkness before them. Lifting his head again to the sky patterned with stars, he prayed to the God of life, greater than the spirit of the night, older than the spirit of the river, wiser than the spirit of his father. And again the voice of the land gave answer, sighing through the tall trees, echoing in bending fir and willowy reed. This was the time of birth, the time of renewal. This was not the time of death. Atmun leaned his head forward on his knees and slept. 3 hours after dawn, they reached the place where the river emptied into the sea. Far out on the throbbing water, the Admunshi saw a ship with furled sails riding it at anchor. To them it was a great bird sent for their deliverance, and in his heart each one hailed it. The canoes were beached, and the captives were driven into a line on the shore. Some of the captors waved whips. Others brandished guns as they drove the Admunshi to the pits. These were the series of holes 10 feet deep in the ground, and into them the people freed of their shackles were herded. Coconuts were split open and tossed into the pits, and the people, now almost crazed with hunger, grabbed at them. Coarse loaves followed the coconuts, and goatskins of water. The captors then laid a rough matting over each pit, rolling heavy stones to the edge to hold the matting in place. Shade from the sun was provided, but such shade offered small protection from the rain. Once a day, the matting was drawn away and food was tossed into the pits. And for 3 weeks, the Admunshi waited. But they did not wait alone. From time to time, as more raids were made into the interior, more captives were brought back and thrown into the pits. Some were from tribes the Admunshi had known as friendly neighbors, other ones against whom they had often defeated themselves. Still others were unknown. But differences or similarities mattered little in the pits, and even language made small bond. Frightened and angry, the captives milled around in their confinement. They fought for the food thrown down to them, and had neither hate nor friendship in common, only an animal instinct to survive, though for what end no one knew. Atmun tried to hold together those of his people with him in the pit, but as the days passed, they seemed less and less able to respond to him, and eyes that had once looked at him with reverence looked at him in a daze, then looked away. The time came when the eyes looking into his bore no recognition in their glance. After 3 weeks the pits were full, and the White Falcon, riding at anchor, was impatient to set sail. During the days, her small boats had been going back and forth to the mainland, securing foodstuffs and laying in stores corn, beans, and yams, fruit, coconuts, medicinal herbs, and vinegar in hogsheads. Once the stores were full, the master was ready to come ashore to do his business with the white traders. He would soon exchange his cargo for molasses and rum, tobacco and gunpowder for a black cargo of slaves. But only the healthiest and largest, the youngest and ablest of all those gathered in the pits, would interest him. Before the trade was made, the captives were brought up from the pits and fastened together by twos at ankles and wrists. They were washed and fed well, then their hair was shaved and their bodies oiled. They stood in a large, patient row, like animals trained at last to obey commands. The traders were pleased at what the time and treatment in the pits had done, for the African tribesmen and women now were what they wanted them to be, merchandise that could be exchanged for merchandise. The traders went up and down the line, surveying their property. "That tall fellow there," one said, "should be good for a barrel of rum, no less, or 20 pounds of sterling." "He'd go for more if he wouldn't hold his head up the way he does," another trader answered. "What the pits didn't do for him, the ship will," the first man replied. "He won't be holding his head up when he steps ashore at where the Falcon from. Where's the Falcon from anyway?" "Boston, but she's going to drop her cargo all along the Atlantic coast. They're needing labor at so many places, and she's making half a dozen calls." A small boat put off from the White Falcon, and soon the master arrived. Together with the traders, he went up and down the line, inspecting the black people. Occasionally indicating one he would not take, that one was removed and thrown back into the pit. No one under 4 feet could meet approval, no one over 25 years. The master of the White Falcon prided himself on being as shrewd a judge of time as he was of flesh. A score of the finest had been singled out and were standing separately, docile in their chains, heads bowed, all but one, bodies glistening from the palm oil. The master felt their muscle, ran his hand down their thighs, looked into their mouths to see their teeth. Then he turned briskly and went into the tent to do business. When the papers were signed, a signal was given. The 345 black people, who, having won approval, had been bought and paid for, were conveyed to the ship and stowed away in the hold. The headroom was so low that they had to stoop to enter. The body room was so narrow that they had to lie spoon fashion, men on one side of the ship, women on the other. Wrists and ankles still chained, they would be given no food until morning. That was part of the discipline of the ship. The mate barked at them, no food unless they behaved. And if they didn't behave, then no food and the lash. But the waves slapping against the ship had more meaning than the words shouting through the hatch. Atmund drew himself up to a sitting position and through the small air chink looked out. The sun was setting. Long lines of light across the water made the distant shore gleam. Mangroves fringed the tawny beaches, and cormorants skimmed over the waves. That was his land, Atmund thought. There he had been born and nursed and grown to manhood. There, for a moment of time, he had stood as chieftain of his people. Where the great bird in whose belly they lay would bear them, he did not know. One thing he knew, that he looked upon his land for the last time. He called to his people in the Admunshi tongue. There were 20 or more in the space near him, yet not one of them answered him. They had been made to forget, not only that they were Admunshi, but that they were men. They made sounds to each other in the darkness of the hold, But they were only sounds. They had no meaning. All through the night, after the ship had unfurled her sails and caught wind that would bear her to on her course, Atmund stayed awake. He compelled himself to remember, as far back as he could in the past, that he might have something more than his body to carry into the future. The Middle Passage took 2 months, 2 months of fair weather, of storms, of calm, of blistering heat, of cold that came out of the teeth of the wind. Once a day the Africans were brought up on deck for an hour. In such freedom as their shackles permitted, they were allowed to move about while their quarters were cleaned and washed with vinegar, when the hose was turned on them and the salt water stung their naked bodies. They were fed their meager rations and sent down again, while anything but utmost docility was punished by the lash. Atmund did not try to talk with his people while they were on deck. The lash would have been his only reward. He was finding it more and more difficult to distinguish his own people, since they did not respond to him. It was increasingly hard for him to even remember the life behind him. Dulled by harsh treatment and inactivity, only the present seemed to matter. A little food, water to ease the mouth's dryness, and a return to the deck of the hold from the fierce glare of the sun. Atmund found that as the days and weeks went by, he could recall less and less of his early life. But there were two things that he felt he must burn forever upon his memory: the face of his sister, so he would know her when they met again, and his birthright. I am a king. Atmund whispered to himself in the Admunshi tongue over and over in the darkness of the hold of the rolling ship. I am Atmund. The White Falcon made her stop at the Carolinas, selling a third of her cargo. Her master was satisfied with the crossing. Of the 345 he had started out with, he still had more than 300. Disease had not spread among the cargo as it often did on a slave ship, and though some of the blacks had died and a few had thrown themselves overboard, a captain expected such things. Impatiently he moved off 100 men and women, those most in need of leading the ship. Bathed, oiled, and clothed enough for decency, they made a good sight as they stood on the wharf at Charleston. Then he waited for a high tide and his fee. 15 pounds sterling he was asking for every black put ashore, though many of them would bring more when put up on the auction block, and well he knew that some of them would never reach it. The White Falcon sailed slowly up the coast. It put in at different ports and dropped off anywhere from 50 to 60 blacks at a time, depending on the need for labor and the price they could fetch. The graceful white-winged bird approached her home port of Boston on the first Sunday in July in the year of 1725. The master gave orders to furl sail and ride at anchor outside the harbor until the next day. More than one slaver had been forced to go elsewhere because she had tried to land her cargo on a Sunday. When the ship drew up to her wharf on Monday morning, 20 slaves, all that remained on her human cargo, were brought up on deck. Among them were the strongest, those least impaired by the voyage, and those best able to stand the rugged New England climate. Atmund looked into their faces. Not one of them were of the Admunshi. Where his people were now, he did not know. The gestures, not the words, of the mate made the Africans understand that they were to walk down the gangplank to the wharf. They moved slowly because of their chains, docilely because of the lash that could cut their naked skin as quickly as it could the air. A crowd of people had already gathered near the auction block, men for the most part, but a few curious women hovered on the outskirts. Atmund was hailed by the auctioneer, and his chains were removed. For the first time in more than 4 months, he could walk freely, yet not freely. He had been given a pair of trousers to wear before coming off the ship, and he found them even more restrictive than chains. The people on the wharf shouted with laughter at the curious way the black youth walked. Atmund mounted the block. Above him, gulls were dipping and soaring, coming to rest on the tall masts of the White Falcon. filling the air with their raucous cries. Edmund kept his eyes on them. Here's a fine specimen of the Gold Coast. The auctioneer began slapping Edmund's shoulder and running his hands down the strong arms, the trousered legs. Well limbed, not much more than a boy, capable of years of hard work, lusty, strong, sound in health. Remember what you get when you get them young. You can train them the way you want them to go. A voice shouted out from the crowd. The auctioneer cupped his ear to hear better. Defects. Why, none at all. Can't you see for yourself? Then he consulted a paper the maid had given him describing the falcon's merchandise. Wait a moment. It says here that this one can't talk. Is that so? He peered at Edmund, towering above him, and barked into his face. Come on now, let's hear you say something. Edmund continued to watch the gulls. The auctioneer shrugged his shoulders. That ought to put his price up. Think of having a black who can't talk back to you once he learns English. The crowd roared with laughter. A man dressed in gray and wearing broad-rimmed hat stepped forward. He looked up at the auctioneer. What's the youth's name? He asked. The auctioneer laughed. Name? None of them have any names. The man went to the foot of the block and looked at Edmund. What's your name? He asked. Edmund had never heard anything come from a white man's lips but commands, curses, threats, none of which he understood. He brought his gaze from the gulls to the face of the man addressing him, for the words just spoken were different in tone. Edmund had no comprehension of their meaning, but he understood the look in the man's eyes. He had never answered a white man. He had vowed to himself he never would, but his lips opened, and the word that came through them was Edmund. The man in gray turned to the auctioneer. Friend, will thee take 30 pounds? And do no bidding for this man. The auctioneer thought for a moment, realizing that he was being offered almost twice what he had hoped to get, even with bidding for the truculent man. The truculent black. He's yours, he said. The money was paid, and the slave led down from the block. He looks an intelligent lad, the purchaser commented. The auctioneer did not answer until he had pocketed his money. That will wear away soon enough, he said. Give him plenty of hard work, and you'll soon have him in the shape you want him. Edmund, the slave said again, wanting to add that he was a king, but the words had gone from him. His own name and the dwindling dust of a few memories was all that he had brought with him from his home land. Call him Amos, the auctioneer laughed harshly. That's a good Christian name for a heathen black. He turned and gestured to the next to mount the block. Come, friend, the Quaker beckoned to his slave, and the gesture was understood. Edmund, the black mouth opened, though no further words came. Amos now, the Quaker said, and started away. So Caleb Copeland, who had not gone to the wharf to buy a slave, but to deliver a load of woven cloth, left the wharf with a slave following him, and nothing in his pocket from the sale of his woven cloth.